Many aspects of social Darwinism developed from the reading, or perhaps I should say misreading, certainly misapplication, of The Origin of the Species, a work that dealt with plants and animals, not humans or human society. Yet Darwin's evidence appeared to reinforce a wider set of ideas pertaining to human social organization. And this has been named, unfortunately for Darwin, Social Darwinism. For many 19th century Europeans, the world appeared to be becoming a violent and competitive place. Those who were strong and vicious thrived, while those who were weak and hesitant suffered. The optimism of the 19th century was always tempered with recognition that more had to be done, but the hope was that reason and moral responsibility would be the vehicles for that improvement. Science was seen as a servant of these higher principles of morality, charity, human goodness. But Darwin had placed man back in nature. Niccolo Machiavelli in The Prince had observed that the world was the playground of the lion and the fox. And Darwin seems to have proved this to be true, and through science. The majority of Europeans, because of their religious training and their inability to reconfigure the world according to the purely material implications of Darwinian evolution, responded angrily, indeed viciously, to the challenge to their most fundamental beliefs. Their arguments, however, were in no way based on science or on evidence of any kind, but rather by appealing to tradition, to religion, to belief, and morality, all of which presume that human beings are separate, are privileged, are divinely created species and somehow outside of nature. Religion and science had become mutually exclusive by the time of Darwin, making debate impossible. You believed one or you believed the other, but it seemed like you couldn't believe them both. In an effort to render this situation somewhat more accessible, to render the objections of moralists and theologians irrelevant, Thomas Huxley, that disciple and an evangelist of Darwin, could never admit to any God. Huxley implied that there was no absolute morality, no absolute right or wrong, because such a concept could never be reconciled with a violent struggle necessary for survival under natural selection. To avoid further debate, which was pointless because the two sides argued from different sources of proof, Huxley introduced a new word into the English language, agnosticism, which allowed the scientifically minded to ignore God and concentrate on the evidence before them, and to some extent allow the religiously minded to accept science and saying we just don't understand because we yet don't have all the evidence. Perhaps there are things that have not been made clear, and perhaps Darwin is not the final answer. The etymology of agnostic makes this clear. It means essentially, I don't know. And this sense of just saying, I don't know, allowed the debate to continue to some extent, but really to become pointless. Because if you are arguing from two completely separate sets of principles and different forms of proof, and one is from belief and one is through evidence, then what's the point of talking? Let's in fact just believe what we choose to believe and continue our separate ways. So if there was no absolute morality, and if God was irrelevant, then suffering and misery were the result of nature's laws, which were there to select out the weak, the infirm, the slow, the lazy, the sick. Social Darwinists asked the question, why should society interfere with nature by sustaining the sick or the infirm, when this would ultimately lead to the degeneration of the entire race, if they should pass along those imperfect elements to the next generation? If they, in fact, were maintaining in this survival of the fittest world, if they were maintaining elements of their being which, in fact, would weaken the collective of the race as a whole. They wrote constantly about the danger of degeneration of the human species if the weak were allowed to continue and contribute to the gene pool. And again, just the roots of the word degenerate from genus and gains indicates that, in fact, it is, again, part of the scientific argument that we must be very careful whom we allow to live and whom we allow to reproduce. If human society is a microcosm of nature, it's reasonable to think that some humans will struggle and thrive, gain in strength and power, remain healthy and beautiful, and pass along those gifts to the next generation. Those who fail, who remain poor or get poorer, must therefore be unfit and weak. And the consequence was then an explosive question. Should private individuals or the state assist in providing for the poor if the poor are inherently weaker than the successful middle classes. Many Europeans, therefore, concluded that any interfering with the natural social selection would be equivalent to interfering with the natural forces that drove the marketplace, for example. That would be unnatural, unscientific, contrary to the laws of nature. The way they believe they wouldn't interfere in the marketplace to make sure that the unseen hand would operate would be the same as interfering with nature. Why would you interfere with something that clearly is driven by a set of forces which have their own rules? And it is not our responsibility, in fact, to intervene. The application of Darwinism to social questions differed from one European country to another. Because Darwin and the Origin of Species had their roots in Britain, Darwinism was to influence political and economic policy and also imperial policy in that nation most profoundly. It was widely believed, at least by the middle classes, that competition was the motivation behind progress and the motivation behind human advancement. Therefore, according to Herbert Spencer, who was Darwin's social disciple, socialists who based their theories on collective or primitive cultures were in fact wrong. These societies were static. In fact, they were backward. They did not advance because they lacked competition. Hence, they were not progressive. Where competition does not exist, Spencer argued, there is no impetus for change, and therefore for improvement. Social Darwinism and the theory of survival of the fittest affected immediately the movements to improve the lives of the poor and the laboring classes through social legislation or even through philanthropy. Any assistance to individuals or to groups through the agency of the state or even through private philanthropy and charity will result in the degeneration of those assisted. So they will not benefit. They, in fact, would be worse off because they will lose the ability and the desire to compete, no longer threatened as they were by starvation or death. Furthermore, such actions would seem on the surface to be by definition good, but they weren't. They actually would result in the destruction of society itself. The charity and the intervention of the state into the operation of nature would in fact weaken the society, weaken the race, and weaken those individuals whom the intention was to assist. The fruits of competition would be transferred unnaturally from the fit to the unfit. That in fact it would be unfair because those who had the characteristics to allow them to thrive would then lose some of the benefits of those characteristics, which would then be transferred to those people who lack them. And so this is not only unfair, it is unnatural. As Thomas Malthus showed in The Principles of Population of 1798, a book that I noted previously that greatly influenced Darwin's thought, there will always arise competition for food among people, as food increases only arithmetically while population grows geometrically. The Principles of Population determine that a Malthusian crisis would occur in the form of famine, which would select out the weak and the infirm, or war, which would give the stronger party access to the food of the vanquished and reduce the population through death and battle. These ideas were adopted by social reactionaries who used them to protest social legislation of every kind, from poor relief to health and safety standards in factories and mines, from old age pensions to national health plans. The image of society as a jungle then arose, in which the fittest grew rich and powerful, and the unfit ever more miserable or perhaps reduced to lunch. Marx, as we'll see in a later lecture, appealed to the laws of history, but the social Darwinists appealed to the laws of nature. The absence of personal income or corporate tax further supported the rich over the poor, and the social Darwinists argued powerfully that this should remain the case. The social Darwinists saw no reason to implement such taxes because they, again, would weaken competition by passing the fruits of labor and ingenuity to those less deserving of it. Public health care, unemployment insurance, safety standards were consequently vilified as interfering with the Darwinian operation of the marketplace and conspiring in the protection of those whom nature has identified for extinction. The marketplace, then, was less often characterized as Newtonian, as in the case of Adam Smith, a great, elegant machine of balance and symmetry in which the laws of supply and demand function as that unseen hand. But increasingly, the marketplace was Darwinian. It was a jungle with no rules, no morality, no pity. The survival of strong companies and the prosperity of favored individuals reflected their competitive superiority, while firms that could not compete shouldn't be allowed to exist. They should be allowed to die, and their less favored managers and workers relegated to unemployment and, if necessary, starvation. This is the law of nature. It's the law of the jungle, and it's the law of the marketplace if you apply Darwinian principles to it. According to the theory, international affairs also can be seen in this, from this perspective. The struggle for life, territory, and dominance were all believed to be, in this Darwinian world, the laws of nature. Nature, through natural selection, would choose which nation, which race was most fit to thrive, reproduce, and increase in numbers and in influence. Those that were selected out, defeated in battle, colonized, or made extinct were simply failed experiments in the Darwinian mode. They simply were to be allowed to pass into history because they were making no contribution to the well-being of the human species. However, there are other interpretations of Darwinism that reached quite different conclusions and working from the same text. Some social Darwinists rejected the extreme individualism of their fellows and instead argued for the supremacy of collectives, defined as nations and races. The great example here is Karl Pearson, who was a eugenicist and a founder of the modern science of statistics. He drew heavily on Darwinism, and he applied it to his statistical work, exploring the inheritance of physical and mental characteristics, as well as the fertility of fit and unfit stock, as he described it. Not surprisingly, given the influence of Auguste Comte and the positivists, Pearson became a socialist, and he rejected laissez-faire economics in favor of state planning, technocratic management, arguing that the struggle for survival and dominance operated not on an individual level, but on a national scale, that it is the collective of the nation, or perhaps the collective of the race, that should be taken into account, not reduced to the level of individuals struggling within the jungle. He argued then for a unified body of Britons. His own term was a homogeneous whole, working towards a common interest. Moreover, he argued that mankind was a social animal. Aristotle was right. We're gregarious. And the Darwinian struggle then was not individual, but tribal or racial. Pearson, therefore, called veneration of and dedication to the state the highest form of social organization. There should, moreover, be no social classes, as social class within the state creates an atmosphere of struggle that undermines the sense of community acting through government. And it's interesting that this is an instance where Pearson actually followed his own advice. He was offered a knighthood. He was one of the most famous men in England and one of the great orators by the Queen, and he turned it down. He said he did not want to be separated out from the group. And so he turned down this honor, so in fact he could actually live his principles, something to recognize that not all philosophers or politicians practice. Eugenics. Eugenics was a term coined by Pearson's mentor, Francis Galton, in 1883. It's the effort to encourage the procreation of fitter stock to produce a better species. And of course, the social Darwinists applied this to humans. And also, if you were creating a better stock, you were discouraging the procreation of those deemed by society to be unfit. To minimize the struggle for existence among individuals and classes within the state, Karl Pearson supported social welfare legislation to strengthen the health and some members of society simultaneously. He also, though, while arguing that the general health of society should be supported through the active intervention of the state, he also said there should be equal active intervention through eugenics. In other words, to identify the weak and the infirm and to remove them before they reproduced and thereby undermine the gene pool. The program of eugenics, which of course would have such terrible implications around much of Europe and elsewhere, was something that Pearson saw as part of the law of nature and the ability of the group to intervene to make sure that the group was in fact as healthy and as fit as possible so that it will survive in this competitive world that Darwin had introduced into Europe. Therefore, Pearson was also seriously worried about the decline of the death rate in late 19th and early 20th century Europe. Because of the improved hygiene and medicine, the death rate had dropped dramatically. But Pearson, eugenicist and statistician that he was, saw death as a means by which races and nations were strengthened, because death ensured, especially early death, that weaker individuals were eliminated from the gene pool, ideally before reproducing. So what he saw then is that the improvement in health was actually something that could be dangerous if it was applied to people who should not, in fact, be kept alive. So you can see that if economics is the dismal science, I really don't know what his kind of statistics could be called. It was more than dismal. It, in fact, was somewhat terrifying. Parallel to these developments in England, there was an active group of social Darwinists operating in Germany. It was in Germany that Darwinism and social Darwinism were to have their greatest influence outside of England. German science proved most receptive to Darwin, and a wide variety of intellectuals, biologists, philosophers, political economists, even theologians, joined the debate. Social Darwinism ironically found its supporters among the progressives, that is, the liberals and the radicals. So as we saw with Pearson, you could be a social Darwinist and a socialist simultaneously. You could be a liberal or a radical and a social Darwinist. Conservatives on the continent, especially in Germany, were far less receptive because of their close ties to the church. They weren't willing to compromise their belief in the religious revelation in order to accept Darwinism as a whole. So social Darwinism in Germany played an important role in future developments. In fact, as we'll see, it provided a precondition for the attitudes that would ultimately inform World War I. And it would be used before then to support militarism, imperialism, and racial competition. The Austrian social Darwinist Ludwig Gumplowicz, in his book The Racial Struggle of 1883, proclaimed that war was an inevitable part of history, and that races were historically and socially constructed. Europeans, he believed, could never be at peace with other races, particularly with Asians or Africans, and that the weaker of these races would ultimately be eliminated by the stronger. So again, a racial argument built into a social Darwinist model. Friedrich Ratzel, a German zoologist and geographer, argued that all living organisms competed in a struggle for space, and suggested in his 1901 book, Living Space, that primitive races had fallen to the advance of cultured races, unquote. Ratzel was more interested in describing human competition, not in terms of species or even in terms of races, but in reference to their level of culture. Human societies were defined by their culture, and they competed for living space at the expense of weaker groups, ideas which would of course be horrifically revived by the Nazi policies of Lebensraum, or living space for Germans, at the expense of those the Nazis identified as inferior, such as Slavs. Today these thinkers appear despicable, but they were working within the social Darwinist framework. They were taking the ideas of Darwin and applying them in a broad area that Darwin had no intention ever of addressing, but which they saw as the appropriate field for investigation and for the application of this new scientific knowledge and scientific model. They saw the extinction of primitive peoples or of an enemy as part of nature. The weak, they believed, and many actually advocated this, should be prepared to die so stronger races could survive and reproduce. This would help civilization progress. And if we look over time, countless peoples had fallen to conquest. Well, so widespread were these ideas and these applications of Darwin's theory to human struggle that the Frenchman Georges Vacher de la Pouge, who lived until 1935, suggested replacing the French revolutionary motto, which became the French national motto, of liberty, equality, and fraternity, with determinism, inequality, and selection. War and struggle, then, became a central theme of many influential works of this period, arguing that it was a means of progress. After all, war had been a significant element in creating Germany, as the three wars of unification represented the anvil on which the German nation had been forged. Indeed, war had energized the German people, and Bismarck stressed that the greatness of the German state would come not from speeches and resolutions, but from blood and iron. It was believed that peace made men and nations weak, degenerate. So territorial struggles would have to be solved by the natural route of war, that war provided the impetus to improve. It focused that element of competition and kept a nation ready for challenge. We can see that this is not only the precondition for the First World War, but of a particular military class. The chief of the German General Staff at the end of the 19th and first years of the 20th century used to like to say at cocktail parties that peace is a dream, and not a very pleasant dream. That war was something to look at in a positive sense, because it actually gave strength and focus and purpose to individuals, nations, and even races. The period leading up to the First World War thus witnessed the formation of groups which worked to strengthen the nation for competition at home and abroad. And this was to be done by training and mobilizing youth to ensure the survival of the fittest. The call for what became known as organized adolescence led to the formation of paramilitary organizations, some of which exist to this day. The Boys Brigade in the 1880s, the Lads Drill Associations, and of course the Boy Scouts, founded by Robert Baden-Powell in 1908, after the debacle of the Boer War. And if you think of all of these organizations, you see that in fact they are paramilitary. They have uniforms, they have a hierarchy, they train for discipline, and they train for Darwinian skills. Boy Scouts, always prepared. Prepared for what? Prepared to survive in the jungle so that you in fact will not be selected out. Prepared for war, so that when called, you will have the necessary discipline and training to be able to defend your nation or to expand your nation at the expense of those that are weaker. This idea then of paramilitary organizations became part of almost the collective unconscious of almost every European state. And not only boys, girls' organizations in Britain, such as the British Girls' Patriotic League, were also formed. But they weren't formed to create women soldiers. They were formed to create mothers for the nation, and mothers that would then instill correct values in their children. Women were to be trained for childbirth, to be healthy for childbirth, and to give birth to healthy children. And then they were to train those children in those elements of discipline and orderliness and cleanliness and all of those other elements that in fact would add to the possibility that their race or their nation or their group would be successful over others. All of these movements of organized adolescence were to instill the discipline and subordination that the young might not have received in their homes, in churches, or in schools. This was especially true about the working class and the urban working class. There was a sense among the middle class and even among the elite that these boys in particular had no discipline. No one taught them to obey orders. They were shiftless. They had no roots. They lived only for pleasure in themselves. What they needed was discipline, order, structure, and then their lives would have meaning. So the middle class, like Baden-Powell, organized these youths so that in fact they could have these principles that would allow them to contribute to the nation, the race, and contribute their lives, if necessary, to the success of the nation or the race. These organizations then taught urban youth to control their behavior and particularly trained them to make sacrifices. Training techniques were based on military methods. There were hierarchies that paralleled the military, and the principles that underlay them were essentially those of military organization because they united physical fitness with moral values that reflected the assumptions of European social Darwinism. All of these examples of organized adolescence had a powerful moral quality to them. Not only are we going to build the body, and not only are we going to establish an element of discipline amongst these youth, but we're going to give them correct values so that when they go out and fight, they'll fight for the right side, which of course is our side. Writing in 1908, Baden-Powell, the founder of the Boy Scouts, noted, quote, "Recent reports on the deterioration of our race ought to act as a warning to be taken in time before it is too late. One cause which contributed to the downfall of the Roman Empire was the fact that soldiers fell away from the standards of their forefathers in bodily strength." No more needs to be said. Imperial adventures led to more competition among European nations and brought them into conflict with other races. This interaction between Europeans and Asians and Africans was a natural conclusion of militarism and imperialism and brought racial theory into the discussion of the social Darwinists. Racial theory, of course, predated Darwin, with one of the most influential works of the 19th century by the French Count de Gobineau, Essay on the Inequality of Races, which had been published in 1853. But in the 1880s, Gobineau found a new popularity as his aristocratic values appealed to the conservatives who feared socialist revolution and the rise of working-class democracy. They feared democracy and socialism as leveling forces, which called for equality, something hardly conducive to competition and improvement of the race. Elements that would, of course, lead to racial degeneration. Gobineau's ideas and the concept of racial superiority became part of the frame of reference, not only of reactionary conservatives in places like France and Germany, but also even among social Darwinists, who began to argue, in fact, that racial inequality was a natural observation, that it wasn't something based on prejudice. We have scientific evidence. And what is the scientific evidence? The fact that Europeans with their greater technology can go into Africa or go into Asia and defeat the natives. And there it is. What more evidence do you need of superiority and, in fact, of one nation being able to control and enslave or even extinguish another? Take their territory, take their property. This concept of racial theory then became particularly dangerous in Europe. And the ideas of Gobineau mixed with this stew of social Darwinism and competitive nature and the idea of the survival of the fittest entered the European imagination in a particularly dangerous way at a particularly dangerous time. Darwin, among others, saw competition among races as a natural part of the evolutionary process, through which superior races were bred. Racial theory thus became another aspect of social Darwinist theory. The other scientist who had discovered independently the concept of natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace, the one who finally drove Darwin to publish On the Origin of Species in 1859, wrote, and I quote him, "The intellectual and moral, as well as the physical qualities of the European were superior." And that, of course, justified anything. Such racial theories, theories of racial supremacy, became powerful justifications for European nations to build huge empires in Africa, in Asia, or anywhere else their technology could carry them. The world, remember, belonged to them. This territory belonged to no one else, simply because the Europeans were able to take it. And we have to remember in the context of the Boer War that the concentration camp was not invented by the Germans in the 1930s. It was invented by the British during the Boer War in order to concentrate hostile foreign populations. It's not something that the British are particularly proud of, but it's also not something we should let them forget. Race for Europeans, then, was biological. It was becoming scientific, and what's more, race was being defined as Darwinian. Darwin had indeed mentioned favored races in The Origin of Species, but his reference was to pigeons, not to men and women. His readers, however, applied such language and ideas to humans. Nevertheless, in The Descent of Man, Darwin stated that the struggle among races was part of the evolutionary process. What had begun then as a theory to explain the evolution of plants, birds, and animals had been reinterpreted over the half-century after 1859 to support competition among individuals, corporations, nations, and races, predicated on the idea of the survival of the fittest. These attitudes would lead to callousness towards the poor, deadly competition among nations and corporations, and theories about racial differences which would lead Europe into its darkest moments in the 20th century.